I'm John William, writer, musician, filmmaker, and jack of all trades, master of none. My grandmother was a writer, and I got my first rejection slip when I was 14 from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, so my first story when I was 20. But I've always loved music. When I married my wife, Janice, in 1979, we decided, well, I need to take a shot at this full-time, be a full-time writer. And I'm from Chelsea. I grew up in Chelsea, Oklahoma. And so my mother was still there and thought, well, we can move back to that part of the country and see if I can write for a few years, couple years, and see what happens. So I moved back there and started writing. So at that time, the Tulsa World had a Sunday supplement called OK Magazine. And it was just a little magazine section in the newspaper. And a friend of mine, Ken Jackson, I'd made his acquaintance, was an editor there, and I was telling him I need to sell it. He said, well, why don't you try to freelance for the Tulsa World? And he said, I know they're looking for freelance stuff. So I said, well, what do I write about? He said, well, write about the stuff you know. Well, about a mile from me was the Totem Pole Park, the world's largest man-made totem pole in foil. And it was at that time, this is early 80s, 81, 82. At this time, it's really run down and nobody's really taken care of it, and it's been busted into and it's just in horrible shape. But I thought, I'll write about this. And I went down there and I talked to the old woman and man who had the store next door. And they just said, well, you know, it's just gone. It's gone to ruin and everything. And wrote the story. On a particular Sunday morning after I'd read it, so they bought it, I went into my mailbox, and there was the paper, and there was my story. This is a little 2-page inside story, right? So I told Janice, well, I'll go down and see Mrs. Holman. She was the one that had the store, and tell her that the story's out. So I drive down my little farm to market road and onto Highway 28, which is where the totem pole is, about a mile. And there are cars up and down the road. There are people pulled in all around this old, dilapidated totem pole getting their pictures taken. I go to the little store next door, and they're 3D, getting pop and buying these old, funky postcards from the 50s of the totem pole. All because of that story. And that's when I learned that every word, every public word you put down has a weight, and you better know exactly what you're doing, and you better always remember how important this is. So that kind of is what started me on the way I feel about writing, and the way I feel about journalism especially. My next door neighbor, my Uncle Rich, who was Cherokee, was a big Bob Wills fan, and I was in band. And the first time he played Bob Wills for me, I thought, my gosh, this is like, and I was a big band fan, fan of 30s and 40s music when I was a kid. And I thought, my gosh, this is like that big band stuff, but it's like country. I was just really enamored of that music. And then, of course, I had a band in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. We were the first band on the Mazeppa show. We were the first band to play the Mazeppa show with Gaylord and Jim and Armin at that time. And we played that 3 or 4 times. We played, in fact, the Leon Russell Christmas show. My band, the Beef Squad, out of Stillwater, was on that show. A friend of mine had brought down the Mad Dogs and Englishmen music video. And I had seen, amazingly, for a brief and shining moment, Tulsa was the crossroads of international rock and roll. This is something I had been a Leon Russell fan. I had read about Leon Russell. I was proud of him. I didn't know until I saw the documentary just how important he'd been to this town, and how this. I was in the service from 71 to 73. I was in the Naval Reserve on active duty, and I was in Vietnam for a year. And I came back from Vietnam, and Jim Milloway, from my friend who had done the Mazeppa show, he was Sherman Oaks, took me to 18th and Boston. This is maybe 72, during the Leon Russell era, I know, but I was just, overseas for that. And you go down, it was like, what was it called? Was it Boston Avenue Market, I think then? So you walk in, and honestly, it looks like everybody in there is either an unemployed backup singer or a member of the British nobility. And you're just looking around at all these people, and the live music's going on. And then Milloway, who was a pretty sardonic guy, turns to me and says, you know what? If you could somehow get Rolling Stone a week early, you could own this place. So I was aware of Leon's influence on this town. It's hard for me to overstate how knocked out I was and how sort of attitude changing it was to see the Mad Dogs and the Englishmen documentary or concert documentary, because, and I've written it before, I mean, he came through and there was just a wake of stardust. I mean, he sprinkled stardust on this city. And as corny as that sounds, it's really the truth. There are still people today, and you know it, you probably see them at the church all of the time. There are still people today who are influenced by him, who are still musicians, who are still, or they had some random contact with him at some point. And I remember what he was like. He was small G godlike, really, in that particular time. Of course, Leon and Gaylord were close. When I was at OSU, of course, this was back when we had the draft, and as long as I stayed in college, I didn't have to go to the service. But unfortunately, things lasted longer, and I had to go anyway. I was at school, and Gaylord calls at college at OSU, and Gaylord says, "Listen, I've become friends with Leon Russell," and he says, "He's just a great guy. He's just like us. He watches you. He's seen you guys do my show." He says, "Why don't you, we're going to go have a few beers. Why don't you come down from Stillwater?" I had 2 finals the next day. A dilemma, you know? And I stayed and I took my finals instead. But I told Leon the story when I first did finally talk to him, knew that he knew Gaylord. I said, "Gaylord, I live out in the country." And Gaylord was always wanting to come out and shoot his guns off in the country. And so we had Gaylord and his family, kind of Gaylord and Ann and the kids, and they come out one day. And so I've got some cans set up down by the pond, and Gaylord is not even getting out of the car before he's like shoots a hole in the mailbox, and the kids are like fleeing in terror, going in the house. And so he's just shooting, and I finally get him down to the pond, and he's shooting. He says, Johnny, he says, "This is great." He says, "I've never done this before." And I said, "You've never shot your guns before?" He says, "Not outside the house." And Leon thought that was just one of the funniest things he'd ever heard. So that's kind of how that first time I talked to Leon, I shared that story with him. And I think it broke down some barriers for him. I started a column in the Tulsa World called the Tulsa Sound. My first interview was Roger Tillison. All these guys who had gone out there in the late 50s, early 60s. I had a column called the Tulsa Sound, ran for years and years and years. I spent a lot of my writing life trying to pin it down, figure out what it is. Now, some of them, I used to have people who would call up and leave phone message and would just castigate me for talking about the Tulsa Sound. I've come to a couple of conclusions. I'll tell you what David Gates said. It's not so much the sound as it's the people who created the sound. By that I mean, Cale told me that, for instance, if in Tulsa you had a gig, somebody hired you for a gig, say you're a drummer, somebody hires you for a job. Somebody else comes along in the interim and hires you for or asks you to do a better job, more high paying job. It was your responsibility to find someone for that first gig that was at least as good or better than you were. He says, I've never seen that anywhere else in the world but in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We were a small community, a small music community. Everybody played with everybody else's bands. Everybody learned everybody else's music. And whatever came out of that was the Tulsa Sound. It was the camaraderie. It was the brotherhood. And it mostly, of course, you had Ann, you had Gus, but the brother and sisterhood, we'll say, of everybody working together and knowing each other's stuff. A certain sound came out of that. I think there are numerous Tulsa sounds. When the Trail of Tears happened, and the tribes brought their slaves with them, and when they got to Muskogee, which was essentially the capital of Indian Territory, they became freedmen. They formed all black towns, A lot of them failed and they all came back. Muskogee in the teens and 20s had a huge center black commerce. And there were musicians. I will tell you, I think that pound for pound, per capita, no other place has turned out more jazz musicians per capita than Muskogee. Now, and to your point, it was on the railway. There was a stop between New Orleans and Kansas City. And so if you couldn't quite cut at New Orleans or Kansas City, you could stop off at Muskogee and get a gig. You know, Barney Kessel's from there. He said he told me he played many places where the audience was all black, the bands were all black. You've got Claude Williams, you've got Jay McShann, you've got Samuel Aaron Bell, who was a huge figure in jazz music and later on in movies. You've got all of these people from Muskogee, but that's jazz. And see, just down the road, that's jazz. They're the jazz. That's the jazz place. Tulsa, I don't know if they were thinking about anything much, but just playing music, right? Again, the sense of community, the brotherhood, the camaraderie has a lot to do with that, and it's coming from the middle of the country. We're not urban, really. I mean, Tulsa's urban, but not really, not compared to New York or Chicago or LA. Roy helped bring country music into the mainstream with his appearances especially on The Tonight Show, I think. You know, he would, all of a sudden, here was this country guy, but he was also on, the urbane Johnny Carson liked him, and so there they were. Yeah, he did a lot. He had a lot to do with bringing country music into mainstream America, I think. You know, he may have had something to do with thawing the Cold War. I've often, because millions of people saw him on TV there, and they're trained in Russia. They were trained to think that we were all just these sort of crazy. And here's Roy making faces, and there's some, maybe the Americans aren't so bad after all. It's like, it's peace and love and music. I mean, if everybody did that, it'd be great. This be wonderful, I mean, there wouldn't be any rage and hatred and that's so cornball, peace and love is so cool, and it is, peace, love, and music. That's what it ought to be. We've played 2 places as the Moody Dudes that have been really important and sense of wonder kind of places for me. Because band's been together off and on. We always say we're the band that doesn't get in a hurry. We've been together off and on since '97, and at that time, Larry Schaefer owned the Canes. The first time I ever played the Canes ballroom stage was absolutely thrilling to me. And then 16 years later, the first time we played the church studio, I've told friends, you just sort of. Yeah, we played the church studio. You only had Russell's studio. We played the church, but there's something about this place. I mean, it has an energy. I wrote a novel called Ghost Band years ago, and the primary thesis is all about music. It was about because a ghost band is like the Glenn Miller Orchestra, where there's nobody still alive in it, but it's still got the same name, and so the name of the book was Ghost Band. And it was about a musician in one of these bands. But the thesis was that throughout our lives, you don't have to be dead to have ghosts. You shed ghosts all of the time. And there are ghosts in the church studio from the people who have been there. There's a feeling, and just like in the Canes, there are ghosts that have been left there by our former selves that I really believe are with us. I mean, again, that sounds so cornball and weird, but there's, for instance, when you have people come through on tours and they're looking at the posters and they're like, do you think they think they're 75 years old? It's not their 75-year-old selves that are looking at those posters and remember what it was like in 1972. It's them as 30-year-olds. That's what the church studio does. That's what I felt when we played. And that's why it was such a big deal to me. I was telling somebody the other day the story that Dave told me about Turn the Page. When they were, I think it was Mike, I think at the time, Teegarden Van Winkle was Teegarden Van Winkle with Bob Seger, and Mike Bruce was with him as well, because they'd brought Mike Bruce up to Detroit because Seger wanted to step out front more and not play so much lead guitar. So they had Dave, they had Skip Nape on keyboard, bass, and regular keyboards. Then they had Mike Bruce playing really great lead guitar and Bob Seger out front singing. So they pull in, it's like winter in Michigan somewhere, and they pull into this gas station like 2 a.m. And they're in one of those trucks that has kind of the cab over thing, and Bruce is driving, and Mike pulls in, and he's a little too high for and it just shears part of the top of the truck off. It's snowing in and everything, and so they get the road. They get a couple roadies, and they're up there with trash sacks and stuff, And in the interim, Seger and Mike Bruce and Dave go to this all-night trucker restaurant. Well, this is one of those deals. Seger and Bruce had hair where they had hats. They could put their hair up under their hats so they couldn't see that they were hippies. But at this point, Dave had an afro, and there was no way to disguise it. So they're walking in this restaurant, and they're getting exactly what Seger wrote in Turn the Page. Had a boy or girl, all the cliche things. Soon afterwards, Seger sits him down, and he says, I've written a song about what happened to us. He says, you want to hear it? And he plays him Turn the Page. Skip Nape listens to it. When he's done, Skip says, well, he says, this is pretty good, but he says, it's too long. It'd never be a hit.